Well, you guys, tonight's guest is a real treat for me. And if you knew me, you'd know exactly why I'm excited to talk to Mr. David F. Walker, the writer, co-writer on Bitterroot, probably my favorite independent series, period. Uh, the writer of Big Jim and the White Boy, which was on my best of 2025 list. Like, there's just so much that this man has done that is just right up my alley. And so, here to talk with me about some of those things, but also for the Monster of Blackenstein, not to be confused with Blackenstein, which is live on Kickstarter right now, is the man himself, Mr. David F. Walker. How are you tonight, sir?
I'm doing pretty good. I mean, um, as we were talking during the pre-show, I'm going through a lot of just nutty stuff. I got a new book coming out next week. I'm running a Kickstarter, and then I'm getting ready to do a mini book tour. So all of that stuff is, meanwhile, it's like I couldn't find my watch for 3 days. So I technically, I kind of knew what time it was, but I I don't know how to tell time digitally, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
I have to look at like an analog face with hands. Like if I just see three numbers in a row, I don't know what that means.
Huh.
I think it's because I'm old,
Right.
So if I look at my watch, right, and the big hand is on the like say is on the four, or actually I look at it now. The big hand is on the is on the three. Little hand is just off the seven, so I know that it's quarter past seven, right? But
Right.
if I saw a digital thing that said 7:15, I have no idea what that means.
Huh. That's like the opposite of what my daughter's got. So,
Well, because your daughter's young. Your daughter's
right.
not like an old ass man who misses the days when phones were on the wall with a really long cord and, stuff like that. So,
That's amazing. So it's really fitting that we're having this conversation. Like you said, on the eve of release of your newest book about blacks in film. It's interesting. So I just recently learned of the passing of one of my college professors, Dr. Norris Frank Woods Jr.,
okay.
who was a professor of African American Studies at UNC Greensboro, my alma mater. And there were two classes of his that I took before deciding to declare a minor in African American studies. The first was Blacks in Music, which was really fun. We kind of went from like the history of like big band and Louis Jordan and Cab Calloway and
Mhm.
all of the things, all the way up to the advent of hip hop. We kind of stopped at hip hop in that class. And then the second class of his I took was Blacks in Film, where we learned of such figures as Oscar Micheaux, and we got to watch God's Stepchildren, and Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, and Shaft, and a bunch of Pam Grier movies because he was a big Pam Grier fan.
Who isn't,
Right, right. But yeah, Dr. Woods just passed away last week, and
Oh,
here I
wow.
am talking to a man who just wrote a book that very well could have been the textbook for that class. Um, it's crazy.
That's it. That is kind of crazy. My mentor, he passed years ago. He was Dr. George Hill, and he written several books about film, blacks in film, um and he took me under his wing, and I remember one of the things he said to me, and this was back in the 90s. He said, um, at some point it's going to be up to you to make sure this history gets remembered, right? And I really took that seriously, and I've always loved film in general, and then I fell in love with Blaxploitation. um I knew of it when I was a kid growing up, but I didn't really, I was too young to see the movies when they came out. I started watching, if something popped up on TV, I would watch it. And if it was, but as soon as home video became a real thing, and that's when I really dug in deep. And, but at the same time, I'm very nerdy. And
Mhm.
so I started as I was reading about these films and finding books about movies in general. There's two volumes of a book by a guy named Gary Null. And the first one is like black film from the 70s into the late 90s. But then the first volume goes all the way back to the silent era. And so when I found that book, that was how I found out who like Oscar Micheaux was, and you know all the films from the 30s and 40s, you know, the Mantan Moreland stuff, and you know, I knew who Hattie McDaniel was, but I really, that was like, oh, there's this whole, you know what it's like the moment the world opens up to you, right?
Right.
And I'm that sort of person who, when the world opens up, I like, you just give it to me. You know, it's like me with Girl Scout cookies. I can't stop, you know. So
Yeah. So I'll ask this then, because you easily could have been a college professor. You could have gone into all sorts of fields, but you've landed in comics and pretty much stayed here, though you've had your ventures in and out. What was it about comics that made it your discipline?
well, it was I mean, I fell in love with comics when I was a kid. And I wanted to, from a very early age, I wanted to draw and write comics in that order.
Mm.
And, you know, all throughout like high school, I was drawing and practicing. And then I went to art school where I discovered that I wasn't that good at drawing, right? Like it's one thing to be the best artist at your high school. It's another thing to then go to school and find out that like you're the worst one there, right? And that was me. But I also, it was at that point that I really started focusing on writing. And and then, you know, that I excelled at that. And I managed to get work at a newspaper as an editor and a staff writer. I'll be 100% honest, I was doing little comic things, as like writing shorts. I was self-publishing stuff. I was going to conventions, and because I'd gone to art school, I knew people that had broken into the industry. But I had pretty much all but given up on like working in comics. And then by chance, I had an opportunity to interview Will Eisner, who is, you know, for anyone who's listening who doesn't know who Will Eisner is, he's like the Orson Welles of comics, right? He's the man. And I had an opportunity to interview him, and this was like 2001. And afterwards we just kind of got to talking, and he was surprised that I knew that much about comics. He thought I was just some dude from a newspaper interviewing him. And I told him, I said, yeah, you know, I always wanted to make comics, and, you know, but I gave up. And he was like, you know, why did you give up? And I was just like, yeah, I don't know. You know, cause I said it wasn't working out. And then he said to me, he said, you know, it's never too late. And I remember this very distinctly. I was 32 years old at the time. And I said to him, I said, man, I'm too old for a career change. And he was 80 something. He had just put out, I believe he just put out his second or third to last book, but he was still making graphic novels in his 80s. And he just looked at me, and you know, that look like maybe your grandparents or like an elder in the family looks at you and is just like, yo, did you just say that was the most ignorant thing you've ever said? And he just looked at me, he said, really, you're too old. And he just turned and walked away. And I was like, it hit me in that moment that if I didn't really try to make it in comics, because when you're trying to do stuff in your 20s, you ain't really trying. Most of us aren't really trying. We think we're trying, but we aren't. And I realized, oh, yo, if I don't push, I'll be in my 50s or 60s and I'll really regret it. And so that was it. I just started, I got really serious, and it still took close to 10 years to catch that break in which I could, you know, pay bills from the money I was making doing comics.
Now, taking on a career change like that late, right? Which, I mean, 32 is young. I'm 35 and I still feel young.
Yeah.
But similarly, comics were not on, well, no, you had comics on the brain.
Yeah.
I didn't start reading comics till I was like 28.
Yeah.
And so I started this channel just over 5 years ago because, like, once I caught onto comics, I was just like really excited about them.
Yeah.
But prior to this, my dreams were like, I'm going to be like a big successful music manager. And as I started to kind of grow disenchanted with the music industry, comics just kind of came and met me. And it's just been a really fun ride since then. But with that has come like, I feel like the younger YouTubers are definitely like at my neck. I don't always feel like I've got the aptitude to take this like as far as others may.
Yeah.
So what was the thing that really had you feeling stable? But then at the same time, was there a different sense of purpose that you moved with?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. So one of the things that happened to me was I was like, again, I was always comic book adjacent, right? And I was in the 90s, I was publishing a zine. And again, for the younger folks that don't know what a zine was a podcast before there was the internet, and it was printed on paper and you would sell it at record stores and video stores, right? And so I had a zine called Badass Mofo. And my two favorite they were bigger magazines, but they were dope magazines. One was Ego Trip, which was a hip hop magazine, and the other was Giant Robot. And it was a pop culture magazine that leaned a little bit more towards, I would say, like Asian American pop culture, right? Well, I met the dudes um, who put out Giant Robot, and they kind of brought me into the comic book world because they said, if you come to comic conventions, there's only but like three or four zine publishers, and you can, make money there. So that helped me. And again, so I'm comic book adjacent. This is really important. And so in the late 90s, early 2000s, I started meeting these creators who were going to go on to become like some of the biggest creators in the industry right now. Brian Bendis, Greg Rucka, Matt Fraction. So I met all these guys really either right before they broke or like just after like they got their big breaks, right? And they all knew me as the dude who was publishing Badass Mofo. They didn't know I wanted to do comics. I kind of kept it to myself, but I was always studying their careers. And, we would talk comics. They knew I knew a lot. And then finally, it just sort of slipped out, I want to make comics. And they were like, well, how come you haven't asked for our help? And I was like, well, because I got to do this on my own, right? Like, I don't ever want to, as it is now, there's still people who are like, yo, he's friends with Bendis. Like that's how he got his break. Just like there's people who've said, oh, he was a DEI hire, right?
Mm.
And so I wanted to make it on my own terms. And that was a reflection of patience. And I didn't start developing patience till I was in my late 20s or early 30s, right? So I knew I wanted to make comics, but I was like, I didn't care if I like writing X-Men wasn't my thing, right? I'd grown out of that particular, I still would read mainstream stuff, I still do, but I had discovered stuff that was like, yo, I mean, Greg Rucka and Steve Lieber did a book late 90s, early 2000s called Whiteout that just was like, yo, this is the kind of thing I want to be doing, right? Um, and but I also wasn't going to turn away work at Marvel. I wasn't going to turn away work at DC. There's the kid in me definitely had that itch that needed to be scratched. But you mentioned Big Jim and the White Boy, and like that's the sort of stuff that I want to be doing. Bitterroot, that's the stuff I always wanted to be doing. Because I was that weird kid who, when I was trying to make comics when I was a kid, I was making comics with my own characters, right? I wasn't. I did one or two Wolverine comics that were terrible. No one's ever. I shouldn't say no one's ever going to see them because I don't hide from my garbage work. But no, so I came into it with, I don't want to say maturity because I don't think I'm a very mature person, but I did come into it with a type of patience that that I was, in some ways, I was incapable of having in my 20s.
Mm.
And by the time I got in my 30s, and I was established in a career at a newspaper, so I always felt like, oh, I could always go back to that,
Mm.
right? Then, of course, the newspaper industry started to crumble, and and I'm like watching it crumble. I'm watching my, my plan B go up the, go down the drain.
Right.
And so, and then I was like, yo, you know what? I'm just going to ride comics as long as I can. And if something else catches my interest or whatever, then maybe I'll work towards it. But I love the medium. I love what you can do with the medium. And that was the thing I fell in love with that at a really early age. I mean, I'm that kid who learned how to read with comics.
Mm. So with that, then you because you've made this decision, okay, I'm going to ride this as long as I can ride this, but you're doing this at an age where it's like, I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm not going to turn down work necessarily, but I've already got a picture in my head of this type of things that I'd like to do, and they're not necessarily the best sellers. So like, how do you navigate that?
Very poorly, man. Very poorly. No, that's a great question. It's They're not the best sellers, but they make me feel good, right? And so I've worked for Marvel, I've worked for DC, I've worked for Dark Horse, I've worked for just about every publisher. I haven't worked for some of the newer ones like Mad Cave and those, but I've worked for a lot of publishers, and I've worked on properties that I loved. I got to write Luke Cage, I got to write Planet of the Apes. I had a lot of fun doing that sort of stuff. But it like, and it was, and I can't emphasize this enough. I enjoyed most of it, right? But I was always answering to other people, right? I would turn in my, you know, like the last major thing I wrote for Marvel was a Planet of the Apes title, and I just kept getting back these notes, and I was like, "Yo, these are the dumbest notes I've ever gotten," and they literally, the main note was always, "You can't show violence against apes," and I was like, "Okay, first of all, it's Planet of the Apes, right? Like, I don't know if you're familiar with the franchise, but," and then I went further and I said, these aren't apes, these are drawings of apes, right? Like, let's not lose sight of that. um and that was about 2 3 years ago, and that was, I had kind of come back to mainstream comics to work on that title, and every time I work in mainstream comics, something happens that reminds me, like, okay, this isn't as important to me, right?
Mm.
Like, Matt Fraction, who wrote, he wrote Hawkeye, he co-creator of Sex Criminals, a lot of like great indie stuff. Matt said to me once years ago, he said, never be afraid to say no, never be afraid to walk away from a project. And I spent several years where I didn't say no, and I wouldn't walk away from projects. And anyone who's had a job that they hate knows that feeling, right? And so now, like, someone comes along and offers me a gig, and I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not the guy for it,
Mm.
right? And
Mm.
there's a couple titles there's a couple things that I've turned down, especially in the last 2 3 years, when I tell people, like, I can't say it like on air, right? But
Yeah.
like, I could tell you later when we're not recording, and people are like, you turn that down? And they're like, why? And I'm like, because when you hire me, you're hiring me to bring my creativity to it. And you're hiring me because you want somebody who knows what they're doing. But
Mm.
then if you immediately start telling me, don't do it this way, and I've looked at people and said, have you read my stuff before? Right? Like, it's not, if someone recommended me, that's great, but read my stuff before you come to me. And so, you know, I've just sort of learned to live with it. I don't have kids, so, if I end up homeless living out of my car, it's just me. I don't have to worry about feeding anybody. And I, again, like, when I look at Big Jim and the White Boy, because that's one of my more recent projects, and it was something that I'm so proud of. Working with Marcus Kwame Anderson's a dream. One, definitely the best co-creator I've ever worked with. And I look at that, and it's like, yo, I created something. It's a big book, and it sits on bookshelves, and it's in libraries, and there's I've heard from both high school teachers and college professors that are now teaching that book. And I had somebody say to me recently, they were like, "Yo, this is like literature," and I was like, "Okay, see, this is, I'm that guy." So when I say that, I love Will Eisner's work, Will Eisner was saying in the 70s, he was saying, comics can be literature.
Mhm.
And so that's sort of what I was, that's what I'm striving for. And I'm not going to say that you can't do literature if you're writing, Aquaman. I'm not going to say you can't do literature if you're writing, The Incredible Hulk, but it's kind of difficult.
Right. Yeah. So
I don't know if that answered the question. I'm sorry.
no, no, no. You're good. You're good. It speaks to what drives you. And
Yeah.
before I even get into my next question, because you brought up Big Jim and the White Boy, I have to share this with you. So
Okay.
uh I was one of those like super readers as a kid that, you know, stopped, I shouldn't say stopped reading, but
Mhm.
definitely like stopped being a great student once, like, I noticed that girls were in the room, right?
Yeah.
One of the few books I remember actually reading in high school was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And it's a moment that I've kind of come to resent, but like we read it as a class. And,
Oh God. Yeah.
and so when we're reading, the whole, I guess, unit is like,
Yeah.
yes, we're going to read Huckleberry Finn. But what the emphasis was placed on was Mark Twain's use of dialect. And it's like,
Mhm.
this book is a great exercise in style. It's not polished or buttoned up, but these people have real voices and so on. And so we're reading out loud. And somehow I end up with the part of Jim for the day. And so I'm reading, this scene. I don't even remember what the full thing is about, but like the he keeps saying shit the dough, like
Yeah.
shit the dough.
Yeah.
And my English teacher was just so enamored by my ability to say shit the dough. And it's just like, oh, this is great, right? And then like I look at back on that, some years removed, and I'm like, that is really weird, like performance that like she was really giddy about, and for reasons that I probably are not great, right? And so reading Big Jim and the White Boy, I felt so vindicated. Like
Yeah.
to be able to take Jim, make him human, make him the hero of the story that he always was, but not shy away from, what the deal was, right?
Yeah.
Like the lesson of, Huckleberry Finn is Jim's humanity. But the lesson in Big Jim and the White Boy is Jim's agency, like
Yes.
making the decision. Every decision that he makes is his own. He's not coerced. He's not, going along to get along. It's like everything is a conscious, deliberate act, and that is something you don't often see of the era. So thank you for just putting that on the page.
No, and thank you for seeing it because I didn't have to read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn out loud. There's another book that I remember being in middle school, and there was a book we had to read out loud, and they dropped the N word quite a few times in it, and it was just like, and I remember being in the classroom, and all the white kids turning and looking, and like, oh, how's he going to respond to that? But when I remember reading Huckleberry Finn, and just even as a kid, just this question kept running through my head was like, A, why is this dude going south? Right? Like every time the tiny lessons we ever got about slavery and the Underground Railroad was like they always went north when they ran away. And I was like, why is he going south? Um and and I just couldn't, for the time when the book was written, I see what Mark Twain did in terms of the characterization of Jim, and it was revolutionary, it was groundbreaking. But by the time I'm reading the book in the 80s, I'm like, yo, this is not working, right? But rather than toss the book out and not read it or complain about it, as with a lot of things I sort of start to take it apart. And even as a young kid, I would think, how would I do this differently? And at one point, I had actually started writing a novel, um, that that was essentially what Big Jim turned into. And then when the opportunity came up to do Big Jim, I was like, oh, I could do this as a graphic novel. And I thank God I did, because that novel, I found some of it recently cleaning out the computer, and I found the files, and I was like, it was just like it was very Blaxploitation, like Mandingo. It was
Right.
like, the Adventures of Huck Finn and Jim the Mandingo.
Adventures of Huck Finn and Jim Brown.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So with that, I feel like I can, look at your, bibliography, and we can kind of draw a through line and find themes. But I'm curious as to how you would describe your work and your approach to writing. Like, are there themes that you like to repeat or explore? Is there a something that you're looking for in your writing that draws you to this sort of types of stories, or what's your aim?
That's also a great question. It is a lot of it really is me taking care of the younger version of myself, right? It's so even going back to Big Jim, right? Big Jim was the sort of book I wish Huck Finn was when I was a kid, and the sort of thing I wish I could have read. When Marcus and I did the Black Panther Party nonfiction book, it was like, this is sort of history book I wanted to be reading when I was in high school, right? And so I have a very strong, vivid memories of the disappointments I felt as a kid reading comics, watching movies, watching TV, in how Black folks were represented. Even with, I talk about Will Eisner, and he's very guilty of that, right? He at least addressed it, and I was actually thinking recently, like, I'd kind of like to do a comic of Ebony, the character that Will Eisner created, and rethink that. I know other writers have done it, other creators have done it. But one of the last things he said in an interview was, it was there for someone else to reinterpret. And I was like, okay, like, the more I start thinking about it and how
Mhm.
Will Eisner played into both how I was inspired as a kid, but then the turn I took as an adult. Um, so again, a lot of it comes down to, what I wish I saw as a kid. And because I grew up in the 70s and 80s, as a lot of the image of Black folks was in flux, but there was still a lot of, like in the 70s, there'd be these sitcoms, and they'd have like the token Black episode, right? Where like Happy Days, or, one, they have a Black friend suddenly, and it's like, hey, I could be friends with a colored guy, and I was always like, oh, this is, you go to school the next day, and all the white kids would be talking about it, and the Black kids. I went to there's only a handful of us at the school I went to. We'd all just be kind of like, oh, and there's a show in the 70s called Good Times,
Mhm.
and one of the stars that was Jimmy Walker.
Yes.
And I would have every time Good Times was on the next day, yo, are you, all the white kids, are you related to Jimmy Walker? And I was like, what are you, stupid? Like, what, if I was related to Jimmy Walker, I wouldn't be going to school here. I'd be going to private school. Like, it's,
Right.
and so, but that's it. I think it's everything I do is ties back to sort of those feelings of, you know, I it's I joke about this all the time, right? I'm very light skinned,
Mhm.
and so I would, as a kid, the question that was asked of me a lot was like, what are you? Right.
Mhm.
And, I was always too white for the Black kids, too Black for the white kids. And I never really fit in. but I identified as being Black. That's the relatives I was around, the people I loved the most. And yet I didn't see anything in pop culture that was really reflecting my experiences, my family, the people I grew up around. And I, at some point as a kid, I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to, I didn't know that I wanted to make this stuff.
Mhm.
I just knew I didn't want to see what I was seeing anymore. Like
Mhm.
I don't have like this. There wasn't like this super sophisticated moment. Oh, there was a couple of them, but it was really like, oh, I just don't ever want to have a moment like I had in watching Superman the movie for the first time. Where there's only one Black character with a speaking part, and he's a pimp, and it was just like, really, like that was, and then at school, a couple days later, everyone's walking up to me going, say, Jim, that's a bad outfit, and I'm like, stop it, so.
That's that's rough. I think. So aside, because you brought up Good
Mm-hmm.
Times, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Ironic name because there's never a good time on Good Times. But I think my favorite episode of Good Times, and favorite is probably not the right word, but there's an
Okay.
episode where one of their neighbors they suspect is she invites them over to dinner, but somebody saw her buying dog food and was like, she ain't got no dog.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
So the
yeah,
whole episode is them kind of trying to tiptoe around this lady's bringing food over, but I'm pretty sure it's dog food. Right.
yeah. I remember that episode.
So the end of the episode is so crazy to me because the end of the episode is basically them confronting this lady and the lady going, well, yes, I eat dog food, but it's crazy to think that I would serve it to you.
Yeah.
And that's everybody claps. Executive producer Norman Lear, next episode. And I'm like, what?
Yeah, yeah,
That
yeah,
is
no.
such a wild depiction. Like,
And so you saw that in syndication, right?
right.
Or on cable, something like that. I saw it first run, man. It was that messed my head up so bad, and it got me to thinking because I grew up around a lot of working class, but also a lot of poor people,
Mm.
and it was like suddenly there was this new fear, like, yo, is my auntie serving me dog food? It's I have so many problems with Good Times, and and part of it was because of Jimmy Walker, right?
Mm.
And I was on a business trip last summer. I'm at a hotel, and the thing I love about hotels is there's almost always Law and Order on, right? And I only watch Law and Order when I'm in hotels. That's the rule, right? And I couldn't get the channel that Law and Order was on to work. And as I'm channel surfing, there's an episode of Good Times. I came in halfway through, and I was like, "Oh no, it's Good Times." And it was the one with Janet Jackson where she's Penny
Ah,
and Chip Fields is her mother, and
right.
I came in right at the halfway point, and I was like, "Oh yeah, this is why I hated this show," right? Because it was like it was this depiction of um I'm not going to say the worst of us, but it was one of the only depictions of Black people on TV,
Hmm.
right? And so if you grew up like I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, surrounded by white folks, and the Black folks are your family, they're the oasis, but all the white folks, the only Black people they know is me, the other kids at school, and what they're seeing on Good Times, and I went to school with some stupid kids, right? Like I knew Batman, I knew Star Trek, I knew all that stuff wasn't real, right?
Hmm.
But they thought Good Times was real, and it drove me crazy. I don't hate it as much as I did when I was a kid, but it's funny because I've been watching episodes of Sanford and Son, and and that's a show where um I like that more when I was a kid, and my grandparents like that one more. But now when I watch it, I'm like, yo, Lamont is really mean to his dad, right? And it's like, and I can't quite tell if it's part of it's the way it's written, obviously, but it's that dynamic, and it's a Norman Lear show, and they're trying to do replicate to a certain extent what they did in All in the Family, but All in
Mhm.
the Family had like Carol O'Connor brought a magic to that. And the antagonistic relationship between him and Rob Reiner was like no show in history has ever captured that since. And so yeah.
So we're talking about like just sort of being peeved by depictions, and that certainly feels like a theme that's carried through into your work, right? Like just
Yeah.
I would call you a caretaker for the image of us all,
Hmm.
right? Like,
Okay.
and
I'll accept that.
I mean, you do it well. Um, and I'm curious, right? I'm gonna ask you about a name, um, Lelia Moore,
Okay.
and how that impacts the work that you do, the image that you have of yourself, and how it carries forward.
That's a great question. So Lelia Moore is my great grandmother. I remember third great grandmother. And there's very little known about her other than that she was owned by a white Virginia farmer, tobacco farmer, um, John Douglas Hancock. I believe that was his name, John Douglas Hancock. They had a they had a son. It was not, in all likelihood, it was not a consensual sexual relationship, and he owned his son because that's how it worked.
Mm.
Nelson Hancock, my great grandfather. And when he was around five, when Nelson was about 5 years old, his mother was sold. She was sold downriver. And I know this because this is the story that my grandmother heard growing up from both her father and her grandfather. So her grandfather is my great grandfather.
Mm.
And so I would hear these stories, and you know, I never heard the story about them being reunited after emancipation, right? Um, and this there's when we talk about history and we talk about the history of the enslaved people who were enslaved, there's so much we don't really talk about, we don't understand, and I think to myself, I had some serious trauma in my childhood, but I wasn't born into slavery. My father wasn't my owner. He didn't sell my mother downriver, and I never saw her again. And so to me, she represents this this huge missing piece of who I am, right? And because I think about there's a study in neuroscience called epigenetics, and it's the for those that don't know, it's this idea that everything that happened to the people in your family that you're related to by blood, it affects their genetics, and then it passes on to you. And that level of trauma of having your mother taken away from you is going to affect you emotionally, and then your emotions will shift your genes, and then that will be passed on. And I I don't want to sit there and go, oh, I feel the pain and misery of my great grandfather, but like it's there
Mm.
in my DNA. It's there in I'm assuming it's there in your DNA in some capacity too.
Yeah.
And so she, because I know her name, and in doing my the research in my family history, she, she's like one of the I've got a couple names that go further back, but there's something, she was the first one that I discovered who was like, Nelson was like, he was almost, I could almost reach out and touch him. You know what I'm saying? He was my grandmother's grandfather.
Right.
Like that's not that far removed when you really stop and think about it, which also means that slavery wasn't that far removed from me. And Lelia Moore just represents, I think, for the best way to describe it is she represents all that's missing to
Mm.
me, right? We all have stuff that's missing, right? And so for me, she's part of a puzzle that I'm never going to be able to solve.
So something you brought up in that TED talk about your family history was just sort of a reflection on the fact that you have both enslaved person and slave owner in
Mm-hmm.
your bloodline, and just sort of the conflict that brings. And then if I take a look at your work, right, like, and your love of Blaxploitation, right, like just you know fighting the man, right, like how how do you work that out, right, like the idea that it's not necessarily like black man versus white man. Like we're all human, right?
Yeah.
It's all mixed in, all of us. And so the point of it is not to fight one another, but still, to sort of fight for a righteous cause, no matter who it's for or against.
Yeah. To me, it's all about asserting our humanity, right? When I say our humanity, in general, I mean Black folks, but there's a whole lot of people whose humanity is like right now it's being denied to them. Um, Women, their humanity is denied to them on a regular basis. People who don't identify as the one of the two genders that a lot of us grew up with, right? We see a lot of that. They're all people who have their humanity taken from them in one capacity or another. And so to me, a lot of it is about restoring that humanity that I struggled with, right? I struggled with understanding who I was because what I'm seeing on TV doesn't look like the world I'm in. When I'm in school and we're studying history, we learn two things. We learn that there are three things. There were slaves, Abraham Lincoln freedom, and then Martin Luther King, got us civil rights. And it's like if if that's all, right? That first off, that wasn't enough for me as a kid. I needed to know more. And I remember being um God, I can't remember. I must have been about 10 years old. And I said to my cousin, because my cousin's very much the same way. And I was like, oh, so, this, when did the Civil War end? We pull off the encyclopedia off of our grandparents' bookshelf and, we see 1860, whatever. And then I was like, and when did we get civil rights? I was like, what, 1964, 65, something like that. And I was like, so we're like, well, what happened in that 100 years, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I said, what happened to all the people who were set free from slavery, right? We were never taught about Reconstruction. We were never taught about the Great Migration. We were never taught about any of that stuff. And it was just, I happened to be very lucky in that my grandparents kept a pretty well stocked bookshelf and would put books in our hands and really, because they were from, my grandparents were born in like 1917, 1918, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they're early part of the 20th century. They grew up during the Depression, grew up during Jim Crow. They were part of the Great Migration, and they knew like where they knew what was deprived of them. They knew what was deprived of our parents, and they were like trying to make sure that we had it better than them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, everything I do is I'm touching upon what it means to explore our humanity, right? And to assert it as best we can, and examining it um, from through a lens of what happens when it's denied us. But I don't always want to be obvious about it, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you just like I want to entertain people, and if some people don't see the subtext, don't understand the subtext of what I'm getting at, that's fine,
Mm,
right? Um, and if people want to dig deeper and see more than I put there,
mm,
that's fine too, right? It's like I think that's the beauty of reading and watching movies and listening to music, where it's like um, you can take something and it becomes yours, right? You know, it's I was listening to some John Coltrane earlier today, and it's like John Coltrane is mine, not him, but his
mm.
music becomes mine. It comes through me, it processes through me. When I hear it, it brings out feelings in me that might be very different than the feelings it brings out in you. And that's what art does, right? I mean, I that's my philosophy. Not everybody's going to agree with it, but you know, they're all wrong.
That's fair. So, it's so fun talking to you, right? Because again, I'm talking to you, and I get the same feeling that I get speaking to a college professor, or even just like one of my elders in the family.
Mhm.
It's just one of my cousins, Zakia. She's like our family historian. Her job every 2 years between reunions is to go up and basically be Skip Gates. Before Skip Gates had a TV show,
Yeah.
this is what she was doing. Like
Yeah.
DNA testing, going through census records, trying to find old family Bibles, whatever she can find to figure out more about who we are, who's connected to us, right? And all that to say, you go and sit at her house, like you're gonna get a great meal, but you're gonna learn something about yourself. And like sitting with people who have the recipes,
Yeah.
as we would call them, it almost feels it's interesting that you hold this knowledge and these keys and this reverence for history, and you choose to be artistic with it as opposed to just like a scholar, or
Mhm.
write journal entries and so on. And I'm curious as to, and I guess you've spoken to it just a bit just now, but like what drives you to run all of this through the lens of creativity and leave it open to interpretation as opposed to just setting it out there for people?
That's again, man, you might be the one to write my biography at some point. Because another great question. Um, so I do teach. I teach part-time at Portland State University. My students all say to me, you're not like any professor we've ever had, you know, because I'll say to them, hey, how you guys doing today? You know, oh, you don't look good. How's your depression? Let's talk about it. We're going to talk about this as a group, right? Because I know some of you are going through it. So to me, though, it's um, I happen to be, and I don't know when I figured this out. I never lost interest in learning, right? I always wanted to know more. I was that kid who wanted to know, again, what happened to all the people after they got set free, after Abraham Lincoln set us free. Um, so I never lost interest in learning, but I was around a lot of my peers who lost interest in it, and and I realized for me the thing that was most fun was when I learned something and then it allowed me to dig deeper, right?
Mm,
So there was a comic book series when it's older than I am, but there's a series called Classics Illustrated, and there was a couple other classic comics, variations of Classics Illustrated. But like that's where I first read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was the Classics Illustrated version. That's where I first read Moby Dick, right? And so I was that kid who would read something like that, and then when I got a little bit older, I'd want to read the real version.
mm,
When I would see a movie, if in the credits it said based on the book by, I would want to go out and find the book, right? And they still do this. They don't do it as much as they used to, but you know, there used to be these novelizations of movies, right? So
yeah.
you go see Star Wars and you could get the Star Wars book. And I would like study this. I would read the Star Wars book and then I get the Star Wars comic and I would compare them. And so I'm wired a lot differently than others, right? But what I also love to do is meet other people that like I can go, hey, check this out. This is what I discovered, right? Okay, so remember in Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, at the end, when Caesar says what he says, that's not what he really said, And because here in the comic it's what and
Right.
and then finally when the Blu-ray comes out, 40 years later, we discover that, oh yeah, there was another ending, right? I always loved learning, and I loved when people shared stuff with me, and I enjoy sharing it with others. Now, not everybody wants to hear it. Not everybody wants to know this stuff, but when you meet other people, so you tell me about your professor and your experiences in this black film class, and the movies you watch, and I'm like, yo, well, what else did you watch? And what did you think? Did you watch, whatever? I can't even think of it off the top of my head, but there's that curiosity has just it never goes away it's never gone away from me. But I also, like I said, I fell in love with comics really early, right? And as I got older, what I discovered was I prefer books with pictures in them, right? I'm, even though I write, I'm a very visual thinker, and I think that there's something, like, it doesn't matter what book I pick up. The first thing I do is I flip through, I look at the pictures, I read the captions, and I'm like, okay, I know this is going to be a good book, and I'm going to get to the part where they're talking about, whatever, talking about Oscar Michaud and Paul Robeson, that we're going to get there because there's a picture of Paul Robeson,
Right.
And so I think that that's it. There's just, I get like my nerd level is really high. Now it's I would say it's peaked, and so I not that I don't get too caught up in contemporary stuff that often. But then, like with Sinners,
Mm-hmm.
bro, I saw Sinners in the theater 4 times. I have the Blu-ray. I've watched the Blu-ray like another 3 or 4 times, and I may even watch it later tonight, right? Like, I can't stop watching that movie.
Mm-hmm.
But when I watch it, each time I watch it slightly differently. So it's like, okay, I'm going to watch it. The last time I watched it, I was really paying attention to how it was edited. So I was watching, the composition of each shot, but how each scene was put together. And to me, it's, I really do want to thank Coogler and the entire team, because I haven't enjoyed a movie this much but again, as a kid, there was magazines like Starlog and Fangoria. Most of the magazines that I could get my hands on were about genre pictures, genre movies. But I wanted to read all that stuff. I wanted to know about the making of Blade Runner. If there's a magazine on the stand and there's, Blade Runner, Raiders of the Lost Ark, whatever, I bought it. I had to know all that stuff.
Nice. So with that, right, like you talked about how you don't necessarily get crazy excited for contemporary things all the time, but I don't know, I feel like we all kind of have the point where like new stuff doesn't matter anymore. Like for, for me, like my love of hip hop might as well end with the blog era. Like there's Kendrick, J. Cole, and Rhapsody. Anybody that comes after them, I might listen to it once just to say I did, but I'm not revisiting.
Yeah.
It's everything from there back for me.
Yeah.
Right. And you seem to have taken to Blaxploitation in the same way. What is it about that period that keeps you there?
I think part of it is that, so like I said, I grew up during that time, but I couldn't go see those movies. I was too young. But I would hear the ads on the radio. Sometimes you'd see a commercial on TV, and there's always stuff in Ebony and Jet magazine. So I knew about all the stuff, but it was kept from me. Right.
Yeah.
And 1974, 75, and I'm flipping through Jet magazine and seeing pictures of Pam Grier, and like, yo, Pam Grier, right? And if you had told me when I was like in 5th grade that we were just years away from having these machines in our home where we could watch the movies,
Mm-hmm.
what? And so for me, it was, here was this thing that I wasn't allowed to see. I saw a handful of movies when I was a kid that weren't appropriate for my age.
Mhm.
Enter the Dragon being one of them. So I learned, I knew who Bruce Lee was, I knew who Jim Kelly was, right? And like these guys blew my mind. And then just probably about the time where I would have been losing interest in this stuff, it's open, the door opens up for me, and it's like, oh, now I can see this, right? Like I remember, some of my older cousins talking about, Blackula and movies like that. And now it's like, oh, no, I can actually watch these. I can understand them. And when you're like a nerd, but you haven't quite found the thing yet, right?
Mhm.
I always say to people, um, you you may have passions, things you're passionate about, but there's going to be the passion that finds you.
Mhm.
And for me, the thing about Blaxploitation was, um, I couldn't understand why these people that I knew were making movies when I was a kid weren't making movies anymore, right? So, you know, 1975, 76, I'm like 6, 7 years old. I know who Pam Grier is. I know who Jim Brown, Fred Williamson. I know who all of them are. And then by the time I'm like old enough to go to the movies by myself, sneak in to see rated R movies, none of these people are making movies anymore, right? And I'm kind of wondering, well, what happened to them? Like, because with the white actors, like, well, there was the ones who died. John Wayne died. That's why John Wayne ain't making no more movies, right? But Clint Eastwood was a movie star when I was a kid coming up, and he never stopped being a movie star. And that to me, like, I didn't understand. I couldn't wrap my head around what happened. And Blaxploitation, like once I got curious about Blaxploitation, I began to figure out, well, what happened to them. And when you look at the history of black cinema, you're looking at um, a lot of lost opportunities, right? And you're looking at a ton of careers that were cut short. It wasn't until the late '80s that a generation of black filmmakers emerged who weren't going to be cut short, right?
Mhm.
From the '70s, there's really only two who survived, right? One was Michael Schultz. He mostly went and did TV. And then Charles Burnett. And he wasn't making a ton of movies. Him, Haile Garima, Julie Dash, a lot of the people that came out of the UCLA program, um, they were making art films and things like that. But that mainstream stuff, I mean, because I talk about that in my book, of all the black directors who were making movies in the '70s. I want to say the only two directors that continued to make anything significant, one of them was Michael Schultz, right? Like Michael Schultz doesn't get his credit where credit is due, because he directed The Last Dragon and Crush Groove in the same year, right? Like he gets the crown just for that. But then Spike comes along, and Reggie Hudlin comes along, and Bill Duke starts directing, and hip hop infiltrates film, and then everything changes, right? And like hip hop was a juggernaut that couldn't be stopped, and hip hop really did it changed film. I mean, changed everything, changed all of pop culture.
Did the Wiz really kill black cinema for that time?
Yeah, it did. It was so here's the crazy thing. I made a documentary in the '90s. I made a documentary about Blaxploitation. 30 years ago, I shot my interviews in '96, '97, and a few in '98. And so in '96, '97, I'm interviewing people, and they were all talking about the Wiz. They were, it was like, what happened? There were other things that happened to really do damage to black film, but the Wiz became the excuse that white Hollywood used,
Mm.
right? I get into it a little bit in the book. I had to cut quite a bit um, out of every section. And I did a breakdown of like The Wiz compared to Grease because they came out at right about the same time. And the thing was Grease didn't cost that much money and it made a ton of money.
Mhm.
And The Wiz cost a lot of money and it didn't make a lot of money. And the thing with black folks and black film is Hollywood will always jump on an opportunity to make it look like we don't make money, right?
Yeah.
It happened with Sinners. They were trying to spin it that way, right?
Mhm.
And um and they couldn't, there was no denying it. That was a thing. And then so the movie then makes a lot of money and then it gets all these Oscar nominations. Even though it didn't win most of the ones it was nominated for, it was like we really started to enter an era where you can't deny it.
Mhm.
But they still try, right?
Yeah.
Like and sometimes we're guilty of doing that ourselves, right? Like I mentioned Tyler Perry in the book. Um and I talk a little bit about him. I'm not a fan of Tyler Perry's work, but like Tyler Perry's like one of the most important filmmakers of all time, not just black filmmakers of all time, right? And what a lot of people don't know, and very few people know the details, but Tyler Perry was like Coogler was consulting with Tyler Perry about how to get that deal that he got, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I would love to hear a conversation. I would love to have been a fly on the wall during those conversations.
Right.
And so again, I don't have to like Tyler Perry's movies to at least respect his game.
Yeah.
And every now and then I'll be like, yo, why doesn't he like just take some of his money and give it to like a better director or a better writer? And then it's
Mhm.
like, well, he don't have to. It's his money, and if he wants to make Medea goes to the outhouse, and folks are going to pay to see it, that's his thing, right? So, um, I mean, at the end of the day, and I'll say this, and he's too old to get mad at me, or to threaten me. Tyler Perry's a way better filmmaker than Fred Williamson ever was, right? Like, if you watch any of the movies Fred Williamson directed, they're way subpar.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
I think he directed like one good movie in his career, and he, you know, but God bless him, Fred Williamson did what Fred Williamson did.
Yeah. So speaking of bad movies, that seems like a perfect segue to
Yeah.
Blackula or
Okay.
Blackenstein, excuse me. So well, here we are. Right now we're knee deep into the campaign for the Monster of Blackenstein. It's live on Kickstarter now. The first goal has been reached, so the
Yeah.
book is funded, and now we are in stretch goal territory, which is my favorite part of every Kickstarter campaign. But I would love to hear just about how this book was conceived and why it's coming to us now.
Oh man, it's a bit of a crazy story, right? So I love movies, right? And I loved the original Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein. Frankenstein's monster is one of my favorite monsters of all time. And I remember seeing in Fangoria magazine in the early 80s, Blackenstein had come out on VHS really early in that cycle. And I was like, there's a movie called Blackenstein. And I knew Blackula because I had seen Blackula.
Mhm.
And I've always liked Blackula. And I was like, yo, but there's Blackenstein. I like Frankenstein's monster more than I like Dracula. I got to see this movie. And that movie was hard to find on VHS. I ain't gonna lie, right? At least where I was. And I had a couple friends that were like, "Yo, man, this movie's the worst movie ever." And I was like, "Yo, it can't be worse than Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter, which is an actual movie, right?" And they were like, "Yo, no, it's that bad." So I finally see Blackenstein, probably late teens, early 20s, and I am mortified how bad it is. It is one of the worst movies to this day. It's still one of the worst movies I've ever seen. Right? It's god awful, and I don't know if this has ever happened to you or to anyone listening, where I tend to be more inspired by the things I hate than the things I love. Right?
Mhm.
Like I see a TV show or a movie or read a comic and it's like, yeah, I don't want to try to top that. But if something's really bad, it really inspires me. So this is not an exaggeration to say that I have been haunted. I've been haunted by Blackenstein for probably like 40 years, right?
Mm.
Like I hate this movie. And it would be, people would say, I'd say this is one of the worst movies I'd ever seen. People say, what's the worst movie you've ever seen? I say, well, it's probably Blackenstein, right? And even though on a technical level it might not be the worst,
Mhm.
it's that level of disappointment, right?
What is it
And
about Blackenstein that gives you that opinion? What's bad about it? Because I haven't seen it.
everything. It's poorly written. It's terribly acted. It's a very ineptly made movie, right?
Mm.
And it's you know super low budget. And the reality is that it was made by people who'd never made a movie before, right? Like that historically, that's the truth, and it shows, right? But it's also, and here's the thing I loved about Frankenstein's monster as a kid growing up was I always related to the monster, right? I always felt like the monster didn't really do anything wrong. Like he wasn't being asked to be brought back to life, right? And I always gravitated towards misunderstood characters. So on Star Trek, I love Mr. Spock, right? And Blackenstein, I, 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 at the time, I couldn't tell you what it was that I wanted. I just wanted something that wasn't in that movie, right?
Mm.
And there was no subtext. There was no real, like, and anybody who's looking for the subtext, they got to look real hard. Now in Blackula, it's there, right?
Right.
William Marshall was a brilliant man, and he brought a lot to that movie. Didn't nobody bring anything to Blackenstein? So I sit around and every now and then I'm like, can't sleep, and I'll be like, man, I hate Blackenstein, and it's like, and I one night it was early in the morning, I couldn't sleep, and for whatever reason I was thinking about how much I hate Blackenstein, and and then all of a sudden there had been this other idea rolling around in my head for a very long time, and I realized, oh, I could reinvent the monster Blackenstein and tell the story that I want to tell.
Mm.
And so I just posted this on my Patreon. The original drawing that I did at like 2 a.m. I did this quick little sketch, put it out there, and then that night I just sort of wrote out the basic story of what appears in the first issue, the one shot. And at the time, I was thinking more like, oh, this is all I need to do. This is all the story I need to tell. And then the more I worked on it, the more I realized, oh no, there's more story to tell. Do people want to see more? We'll find out after that, once the Kickstarter's done. But
Mm.
it's and I also wanted to make a comic that paid tribute to, the monsters that I loved, that paid tribute to Blaxploitation to a certain extent, but
Mm.
I wanted to be like a satire. I wanted it to be, I wanted some people to be confused and go,
Mm.
is this like, I remember watching Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, watching it in the theater with my cousin. And we're watching it in one of them ghetto theaters, right?
Mm.
Where it's like people run around screaming, kids, and we're sitting there watching the movie. And like about 15, 20 minutes in, I look at him and I go, yo, man, is this movie a comedy? And he was like, oh, and then we just started falling out. We're laughing. We fell in love with the movie, right? But I like that type of comedy where you don't always know right away that it's a comedy. You're like,
Mm.
something seems a little weird about this. And when it comes to horror and comedy, especially, I like that where there's a level of uncertainty. What I wanted to do with this thing was I wanted to write it as seriously as I could. I wanted to read like something that was, I like the comics that I read in the 70s, but I wanted to take it one step further. I wanted to create some satire, and that was it. I realized that I had been dying to make a monster, just like what I had done with Jim in Big Jim and the White Boy.
Mm.
I wanted to make a monster who was a black man and give him agency and make sure that everybody knows he's the hero of the story.
Yeah.
He's the like because at the end of the day, um, whenever we turn on the news and we would see, George Floyd, Mike Brown, Breonna Taylor, we know who these people are. We know what happened to them. And we also know how the media tried to turn each and every one of them into a monster at one point or another. And that's what they've always done with us. And I, I just wanted, I needed to say something about it. And I needed to say something about it in a way that demented fools like me would would laugh at it as opposed to getting really angry, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also grew up listening to a lot of Richard Pryor, right? And Richard Pryor is simultaneously the funniest person, one of the funniest people of all time, and also one of the most unfunny people of all time. Because
Mm-hmm.
like if you really listen to what he's saying, you're like, oh my God, this is just tragic,
Yeah. And it's like he's not joking.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
like it's I don't know. There's a lot made now of comedians, right? And like I guess Dave Chappelle is the barometer, right? And so now it's like you almost expect a lecture from a
yeah,
comedian. You go away like expecting to walk away with a theme.
yeah,
But Richard Pryor is like super funny, but like you're listening, it's like, no, this isn't, he's not joking. He's just saying crazy things like or traumatic things
yeah,
in a way that makes you laugh about them. And that's a
yeah.
different thing.
And it's in some ways, so I'm discovering Pryor when I'm a kid, listening to the party records, seeing the concert films when they show up on cable, and laughing in part because he is very funny, but he's using a lot of profanity, which sounds funny when you're a kid, right?
Right.
Um, and then at one point, this was probably 20 years ago, they reissued all of his albums on CD, and I got the big box set. And you sit down and I started listening to it, and I'm going, this isn't as funny as I remember. It's
Mm.
funny, and it's as funny as I remember, but now I'm hearing I'm entering adulthood, or I'm in adulthood. I'm in my 30s, and I'm listening to this and I'm going, yo, this is a rough childhood. This is a rough, and of course this is also the hindsight of all the drug problems he had, and how he tried to kill himself and all that stuff. So but yeah, I think that there's within the realm of comics, especially, there's a lot you can do, and I don't see as many creators just going for it, right? Like,
Yeah.
what's the worst that's going to happen? People don't like it. They don't
Mm.
like my comic. That's fine. Like I grew up with people not liking me. They've liked me for far less than a comic book that I wrote.
Right.
So
I will say, like, because there's not much I can say about this book because I risk spoiling it. It's a 40-page,
yeah,
comic. So there's not too much I can tell you about it, except that it is like a quintessential David Walker book. Like it is everything that you just said it is. It's funny, it's poignant. There are the gags, right? Like it's a running joke, right? Because I'm
yeah,
in ministry, right? Like my channel's pretty squeaky clean,
yeah,
right? Like you're not gonna hear too many MFers out of me.
yeah.
But the fact that that is like Blackenstein, like sort of monster grumble, is hilarious, right?
Now I'll tell you something. I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. At some point, because there's going to be more stories later, he's it's like Groot when he says I am Groot, but only
Uh-huh.
Rocket knows what he's really saying. Or in before that, it was Star Wars when Chewbacca would say something. He's actually saying something. He's saying
Mhm.
more than people are gonna, but that's coming way down the line, right? And but my thing was I didn't want any profanity in the book. Like
Mhm.
I made this purposeful decision. There's going to be no sex and no profanity. And I had said to Marcello, the artist, I said, okay, here's going to be an action scene, fight scene. Feel free to be as violent as you want. And when the pages first came in, I was like, oh, oh, this is like might be too violent. And then I was like, nah, this is good. This is like suddenly becomes funnier
Mm-hmm.
because and it was to me it was like watching some of Peter Jackson's earlier movies, like Dead Alive, when like you're going, did that dude just is he using a lawnmower to kill people? And
Mm-hmm.
so but thank you for saying that because it was when you say that it's quintessentially David Walker, um, there's I've been showing it to people and Ray Anthony Height was one of the people I showed it to really early on. Marcus Kwame Anderson, my creative partner. There's people like that I was showing it to, and a lot of people were saying the same thing at first. They were like, "This is a lot of words. Do I got to read all these words?" And I was like, "Yep, you got to read them." And Bendis especially, Bendis and I, we've been friends for 30 something years, and we write together, we teach together. And the first thing he said was like, "I'm not reading all these words. There's too many." And coming from him, because that is like the
That's
wordiest
crazy.
dude in comics, right?
Right.
Um, and then a couple days later, he texts me and he was like, "This is one of the funniest things I've ever read." He was like, he's like, I don't know how you did it. And that's what a couple other people have said to me. They were like, how did you, and it's especially people who are familiar, they're literate when it comes to older comics from the 60s and 70s. And they're like, this almost reads like that stuff, but it's just a little bit over the edge, a little bit over the top. And I was
Right.
like, it wasn't easy. It was the first time I broke out my thesaurus like that in a very long time, so
Even like the lettering, like kind of is like a callback to like the classic sort of EC comics
yeah.
style. And
And okay, can I interject? This is
sure.
hilarious, right? I lettered the whole thing myself, and I'm looking at it and I'm going, something's wrong. I can't figure out what's wrong. I couldn't figure out if there's something wrong with the lettering, whatever. So I sent it off. And then Bendis is the one who's at first he says to me, "It's too many words. I don't want to read all these words, right?" And then he reads them and he goes, he's complimenting me. He says, "I only have one note." He said, "You got to change the font." And I was like, "Why?" And he goes, "It looks a little too modern, and you're trying to evoke this other era." He said, "You've got to find a font that looks more like what you would have seen in EC or in comics in the early 70s." And the moment he said that, like this light went off in my head. And I talked to my editor that I'm working with, and I told her, and she was like, "Huh, that might be it." And then so I relettered everything, and then she was like, it's because I'm a lettering fanatic when it comes to stuff like that, font choice. And so you're saying that, I'm like, all right, I got to remember your birthday now because you talked about the font.
No, it's really good. I think I don't know it to talk about something as ridiculous of a concept like as Blackenstein,
Yeah,
and for it to resonate with all the themes that you've mentioned that I won't recall because again I don't want to spoil
yeah,
this book, but like it's like you're reading the book and it's like this book is a riot.
yeah.
By the time you get to the end of Blackenstein's story, it's like, how did he pull that off? Like, how is all of this in the same book and it makes sense to be there? And why do I want more?
Yeah,
Like, between the kids on the stoop, like there's so much that is like just straight up hilarious. And
yeah.
then there's other stuff that's just really poignant and resonant, and it all fits in this package that seems over the top, but it's just perfect.
It's what excites me the most about this, and I haven't talked about it too much, is that within the world of Blackenstein, there's a larger world I'm about to explore, right? So there's going to be two, maybe three advertisements in it
Mm.
that are spoofs of the sort of advertisements that were in comics when I was a kid in the 70s, right? There was the Charles Atlas ads, and there was the Count Dante's Black Dragon Fighting Society ads, stuff like that. So what I created was a character named Jaguar Jackson, and Jaguar Jackson has his combat academy, right?
Mm.
And so there's these ads for the Jaguar Jackson Combat Academy, and but then I was like, oh, there was these ads for LaSalle University, which was like a mail order college thing in the 70s.
Mm.
And I was like, what if Jaguar Jackson also had his own university, right? And so I've created these ads that appear in the comic, but then Jaguar Jackson is a person that later on they're going to be talking about, right?
Mm.
And so the kids, when we see the kids again, they're going to be talking about the shows that they watch and the comics that they read. And then there's more monsters that are going to be introduced. There's
Mm.
some vampires. There's our equivalent to a werewolf. The less I say, the better. But
Yeah.
the werewolf, there's a 4-page story that'll be in the back of this Blackenstein comic that introduces, but he ain't a werewolf. That's all I can say.
Okay.
And it will be, if anyone is not offended by something in Blackenstein in the 24 pages of that story, in the 4 pages of this other story, I think a couple jaws will hit the floor and people will be upset, and that'll be fine because every now and then you need to just rattle the cage, and I didn't realize, this is the thing, I didn't realize how much I needed this character and I needed these stories. There was a lot of pent up frustration, a lot of pent up anger, and that I think a lot of us have. And but I don't necessarily want to see something or read something that makes me angrier. I want to see something that kind of, makes me laugh, makes me chuckle, makes me think, and realize that this is how we survive, right? Like, Sinners is about how the blues helped us survive. Humor helped us survive, right? Richard Pryor showed us how to
Yeah,
laugh at the worst things that we could experience.
for sure. So, before we close, which, first of all, we had this entire hour-long conversation and somehow didn't talk about Bitterroot. So there's definitely got to be a part two.
I will come back.
Awesome. So I wanted to show everybody the campaign page just so we can see, you guys can get a little bit of a preview of this art. I did see your Patreon post earlier today, just with like that initial sketch
Yeah.
of like what Blackenstein's monster would look like. Like, and it's really cool when people are like visual first. But
Yeah.
I would love, to shout out the artist and the creative team on this book outside of you.
Yeah, so that's, Marcello Di Chiara and Pedro Estuco they're both out of Brazil. I I'd been trying to find some artists to work with, and it just, everything wasn't working out. A couple things went wrong. And so I reached out to a friend of mine who reps a bunch of artists out of Brazil, Joe Prado. And I said, Joe, I need somebody. And I told him what I wanted. I'd sent him a short version of the story that was sort of a proof of concept. And I said, I'm looking for this style of art. A couple days later, he sent me some samples, and then we were just off and running. And so that was that right there was meant to be the original cover. And then I got Joe Jusko, who's a legend in the comics industry. And so I'm still using that cover for the black and white edition, because there's a black and white, no dialogue version. And that's just meant for people who really just like a visual story. And because the story actually does make sense without any words. It was, I needed to make sure of that on my own. So the words, you actually don't have to read them. I appreciate it if you do, and I think, the fact that it takes nearly 30 minutes to read a 24-page comic is a major victory, because most of the times, we get comics at the stores now and it's like 7 minutes later, you're done reading it.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, as a side note, 286 Kickstarter projects backed. Nobody can accuse you of not being able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
I really got very active in terms of backing stuff on Kickstarter during the pandemic.
Mm,
because I wasn't able to go to conventions. I love indie comics. I love indie creators. I love seeing what they're doing. And I think there's a lot to be said for people who, if somebody says no, you go and do it yourself.
yeah.
The fact of the matter is I talked to some publishers about the Monster of Blackenstein, and they just didn't get what I was trying to do.
Mm,
And I could have convinced, there's a couple publishers I could have convinced to do this. But two things would have happened, three things. One is they wouldn't have paid me any money. They would have wanted to own part of the intellectual property. And because they don't understand it, they wouldn't um, they wouldn't be able to push it properly, right?
yeah.
And then when it came time for me to go to conventions and I wanted to try to sell a comic, I'd have to buy the comic from them, and I'd be paying, I get it 50% off, but I wouldn't, there'd be no profit in it.
Yeah.
And that's why I started doing Kickstarters my own self. Was um, it just, in some ways, it, not every case. And when I come back and we can talk about Bitterroot next time, Bitterroot made sense to do it that way.
Yeah.
Blackenstein made sense to do it this way. And in a lot of ways, Blackenstein is my mixtape, right?
Mm,
It is me doing what Too Short did back in the day, and all those other guys that I grew up listening to, who were making mixtapes and selling them out of the trunk of their car. I'll
yeah.
be selling these out of the trunk of my car.
Nice. So, you guys can grab, first of all, this is not an expensive campaign. A lot of times you'll get a book on Kickstarter and it's like you're paying $60 out the door for like the basic thing and a couple of add-ons, like you want the bookmark or the shirt and whatnot. But I mean, you can get the regular book and the black and white in a bundle for $25. Like that is insane. Like such a good deal. But so you guys can go to let's go to comicsaredope.com/Blackenstein. Actually, no, I'll change the link. Go to comicsaredope.com/Walker, just in case you try to spell Blackenstein the wrong way. But comicsaredope.com/Walker, that'll take you to the campaign page pretty easily. So you can go ahead and back this before it's up. But you said something, just now, but also earlier in the show, and I'm curious about it because you've navigated, you've worked for just about every publisher. You've talked a little bit about like red tape and snafus with editors and so on. And we're in this weird conversation right now just about indie comics, especially as it relates to like Black people and portrayals, as opposed to what can you do inside of the big two or some of the more major
Mhm.
publishers. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on how we best sort of handle the baby that is Black representation in comics.
Well, I think that what we need to do is if we do need to support indie comics more, right? And I by that I don't just mean Bitterroot or Philadelphia. Those are the probably we're amongst the two bigger ones out there, right? But I'm talking stuff that like Ray Anthony Height's doing or Jason Reeves is doing, TJ Sterling, Quinn McGowan, the usual suspects.
Mhm.
Um, and if you're a mainstream comic head, and if you love Milestone, that's fine, right? You can like that stuff and you can explore other things, right? And I it's not a all or nothing equation, right? What I would say is like, okay, if you like Batman, instead of buying all five variant covers of a title, just buy two. And then with the money you save, go support an indie creator, go back a Kickstarter, right? Go look for, because there's something out there that you might not even know you like it yet because you just haven't explored, right? And there's, if you follow people, like there's stuff out there all the time. I mean, again, like you said, 286 things that I backed on Kickstarter, and I'm still backing stuff. I still look for stuff to back, and the beautiful thing about Kickstarter is that just I can just do the digital rewards, and then I don't have books stacking up, and I can still see stuff. And the thing that we really need to do, I think we need to do, I don't even do it as much as I should, but like, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, right? Like, the conversation that's been going on the last couple of weeks over Milestone is fine, but that's all anyone was talking about was Milestone, right? There's so much other indie stuff out there, and it's like at the end of the day, I know every single creator who worked on that Milestone comic that just came out, and I know all the founders of Milestone, right? I'm that old that I know all of them. And I've also worked for DC and I've worked for Warner Brothers, right? And what I need to tell all those people that are, really pounding the Milestone drum, they don't care about you, right? They want your money, but they don't care about you. Now, I ain't going to say I care about everybody, but I guarantee you I care about folks more than Warner Brothers does, right? More than DC does. And I've worked for them. I've been in the room with them. I know how a lot of these people think. And the fact of the matter is that they somehow, so many of us were championing this book that just came out, and they're basically saying, hey, if you don't buy it, the book isn't, no Milestone characters are going to get a regular monthly book. And that's a load of garbage. They could give any character they want a monthly book at any time. They're choosing not to, right? And they're going to come up with all these excuses. And you know what they're doing? They're doing the whiz, right? They're doing the same thing. They're saying, oh, the whiz didn't make enough money, so therefore it was a bomb. They say that about a lot of stuff, but then, some people still keep getting to make movies. Some people still keep getting to make comics. There's that all or nothing thinking that we get caught up in. And they condition us to be that way, right? They condition us to be, I'm Marvel all the way, or I'm DC all the way, and again, you can like that stuff. I like that stuff too. But I guarantee you there's better stuff out there, right? There's some truly amazing stuff. Just if any of y'all haven't read Philadelphia yet, Rodney Barnes's book, come on. I'm not even saying go out and read Bitter Root.
Mm-hmm.
Go read Philadelphia. Stephanie Williams has got her new book through Ignition, and it's something root. It's the root
Roots
of evil, I think. Roots of Madness. Check that out, right? Or go even deeper. Go, see what Jason Reeves is doing. See what TJ Sterling is doing. They are, I think, Greg Anderson Elise, Greg Burnham, Newton Lilavois. These are all people that are doing some amazing work. And in Ngozi, I can't remember Ngozi's last name, but she does Check Please, and then she did some, like, you just don't know what you're going to discover. And here's the thing: you can buy the stuff digitally, or you can go. Some of the stuff is in the library, right? So go to the library, check it out, and then share it with people, right? Because a lot of this indie stuff is actually an easier entry point than, Black Panther. Where do you start with Black Panther? Do you start with Ta-Nehisi Coates' stuff, or do you start with the stuff that Don McGregor wrote in the 70s, or Jack Kirby, or Reggie Hudlin, or Christopher Priest? You can get lost, and Marvel, Disney, they want every dime they can get out of you. They'll sell you the same version of the same book 10 times, right?
Right.
I wish I could do that. I wish I had the money to, do so many versions of Blackenstein, and it's all the same thing. But there's a reason why there's only one cover, right? There's two versions of the book. There's the black and white silent version, and then there's the main one. But there's a reason for that. And the reason why is because I don't want to take that much of anyone's money. I would rather you spend some money with me, and then go spend some money with some other folks. Like that's the socialist in me, right? That's the that this community, if we are going to survive, and anybody out there who wants to break into comics, who wants to make comics, you will spend more time and energy making your own stuff. The longevity at Marvel and DC, there's only a handful that have careers that last a long time, right? There's when they get rid of you, they get rid of you. And I told this to I don't think you would mind me telling this story. I was talking to Morgan Hampton the other day, or about a month ago. Mm-hmm. Morgan's working on one of the Green Lantern titles, and he's having his moment. Yeah. Right. I'm so happy for him. I've known him for a long time. Saw him come up, saw it happen for him. And I said, I'm only asking you to do basically two things. I'm asking you to make sure that you set aside a little bit of money from every check you get for your taxes. And then you set aside a little bit of money to hire an artist to do a one shot. Mm-hmm. And he said, a one shot. And I said, of a creator owned series, right? But make it a self-contained story that on the off chance you can't find a publisher who's interested in it, you've got that proof of concept that you can take around and you can show to people, and it establishes what you've got, but use the money you're making from DC to pay for that. And I would say that to any writer or any artist who wants to do it. Take a little bit of that money and invest in yourself, because, and this is where they get mad at me, right? When you're working for Marvel, when you're working for DC, when you're doing work for hire on someone else's intellectual property, are you ready for it? You're a sharecropper. That's what you're doing. And I don't hey, that's fine if you want to. I do sharecropping work. I've done it. I'm doing something right now. I got to turn in the script next week. But at the end of the day, if you want to be really creatively fulfilled, you have to create your own stuff. Because at some point they'll say to you, "Oh, Batman would never do that," or worse, your Incredible Hulk series didn't sell well. See ya, you're not here anymore, right? I mean, that's essentially what happened to me. My titles never sold that well at Marvel, and at one point they were like, "Okay, you had your chance. See ya." I couldn't get mad. That's the reality of it. So what did I do? I started making my own stuff.
So we're talking about the creator community, and this will be the last question before we roll out. But
okay,
what I love about especially the Black indie creator community is you go to a convention and it's like a family reunion.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
All those names you mentioned, right? I go to Heroes Con in June, and it's bittersweet because it's always Father's Day weekend. But I get there and it's just okay, there's Stephanie and Ryan Oakley and Greg Elise and Ray Height's there, and Sanford Green's there, and Chuck Brown is there. And for the last 2 years, David Walker has not been there. Right? When are we going to get you in Charlotte again?
That's a great question. I want to try to make it this year if I can. And this is the truth. If I ask Chuck to help me get in at Heroes, he'll do it. Mm-hmm. If I ask Sanford, he's always too busy. He forgets all this sort of stuff. Sanford is the one out of the three of us who has the best connections at the conventions, right? And I, for me, it's okay, I'll cover if I absolutely have to, I'll cover my own airfare. But someone's got to put me up in a hotel, right? I can't sleep on somebody's couch, man. I'm an old man with a bad back. I do want to come out to Heroes if I can, and in fact, I need to reach out to Sanford and Chuck about that, because I would only bring two things. I would bring Blackenstein, and I would bring a book that I self-published last year. That's it. I really, but what because Heroes is such a great show for artists, mm-hmm. and I wanted there's something I want to do with Blackenstein that is really opening the doors to working with established artists, but I've got a game plan that's coming that's going to give work to younger up and coming artists, and it won't be big work, but it'll be something professionally published that you can say, you can hand to people and go, okay, here's a monster ripping someone's arms off.
Nice. Well, listen, Carla, if you're listening to this interview, somebody call David Walker. Somebody handle the airfare. Carla, Seth, we got to figure this out because you are the last signature in my Bitterroot hardcover. I got the trade signed a few years back.
Okay.
Then the hardcover came out like just a few months later. And I'm like, no, now I got to have this. I got to get this signed. And then at some point we got to recollect it with volume 4 in there. And then we'll start the signature search all over again.
Yeah, no, we gotta. It would be nice. I like doing shows with Sanford and Chuck. I really do. And I especially I like hanging out with Chuck. I don't think he believes me when I say that. I Chuck is I really I love Chuck. I really do, and he's Mr. Grumpy and, he won't smile or anything like that. But yeah, I'll send out a couple emails in the next couple days and see if I can make Charlotte happen. And a lot of it's just these shows are expensive to do. And if you can't get some help in some capacity, you can be dead in the water, so.
True. Well, look, man, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I got to give a huge shout out to Ray Anthony Height for connecting us. He was like, man, you need to talk to David. Y'all would hit it off. And he's got a really great book coming. And he was right about both things. So
Ray is great. I love Ray. Ray is family. Ray and his whole family. I love him. So yeah, no, I'm glad this worked. Reach out to me anytime. You got my contact info. I'd love to come back. Clearly we can talk at length. So
right.
And we didn't even start talking about James Baldwin. So yeah,
Man. All right. See, yeah. Next time.
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Walker, thank you again for your time. Thank you guys for listening. Go to comicsaredope.com/Walker to back the campaign for the Monster of Blackenstein, which is not to be confused with Blackenstein. You've got until April 13th to back the campaign and get those rewards locked in. And after you do that, stay safe, stay awesome, and read something dope today. Peace.